Thank you so much for coming out in the terrible weather today to be here with three extraordinary authors. I'm super excited to be in conversation with each of them. Their works are amazing. If you have not read them or purchased them, please make sure you do. So we're going to get started. I'm going to introduce you to our three amazing authors. We're going to do some readings from each of the authors. We'll do some questions, and then at the end, if we have time, we'll do a little bit of Q&A with the audience if you all have questions. And then just a bit of housekeeping. Please make sure your cell phones are off or silent. And we will need to be out of the beautiful courtroom by 3:50 to make sure that the next panel can come in timely. All right, so good afternoon. My name is Sarah Hai. I'm with bookshop.org, which is an e-commerce website to help support local independent bookstores. If you're not shopping through your local indie, you can shop through bookshop.org. Before we begin, please make sure to purchase the books, as I mentioned. The official bookstore for this panel is Community Bookstore. Unfortunately, they won't be able to sell the books because of the weather, but please make sure you purchase the books through your local indie. And authors, we're probably not going to do signings unless you'd like to, just because of the weather again. But all right, so let's get started with the author bios. So first, we are joined by the amazing Tiphanie Yanique. Tiphanie is the author of the award-winning novel Land of Love and Drowning, as well as the short story collection How to Escape from a Leper Colony. She's the winner of the 2014 Center for Fiction First Novel Award and a National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 honoree. She has also received a Rana Jaffe Award and a Fulbright Scholarship. Her short fiction has been published in The New Yorker and anthologized in Best American Short Stories 2020. Originally from the Virgin Islands, she now lives in Atlanta, where she is a professor at Emory University. Her latest novel, which we are going to talk about today, is, of course, Monster in the Middle. Please welcome Tiphanie. And next up, at the end over there, we've got Colin Barrett. Colin is from County Mayo, Ireland. In 2009, he was awarded the Penguin Ireland Prize. Sorry, my pages are all messed up. And in 2014, his debut collection of stories, Young Skins, was published and awarded the Rooney Prize, the Frank O'Connor International Short Story Prize, and the Guardian First Book Award. In 2018, Colin was announced as a Rolex Arts Initiative literary protege, mentored by Colm Tobin. His stories have appeared in The Stinging Fly magazine, The New Statesman, Harper's, and The New Yorker. His second collection, Homesickness, was published in 2022. Please welcome Colin Barrett. And last but certainly not least is Leigh Newman right there in the middle. Leigh Newman is the author of Still Points North, a memoir about growing up in Alaska, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle's John Leonard Prize. Her stories have appeared in Harper's, The Paris Review, Tin House, McSweeney's, One Story, and Electric Literature. In 2020, she was awarded the Paris Review's Terry Southern Prize, a Best American Short Story, a Pushcart Prize, and an American Society of Magazine's Editor Fiction Prize for her work in the Paris Review. Nobody Gets Out Alive, a short story collection, is her latest book. Please welcome Leigh Newman. So as we can see, I'm in the company of three amazing authors. Before we dive into questions, I would love for the three authors to read a 5-minute or so excerpt of their work. Tiphanie, let's start with you.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. So nice to see you. Thank you guys all for coming. Thank you, Sarah, for hosting us, and such a pleasure to be reading with Leigh and Colin. I'm just going to start from reading from the beginning of my novel. The novel is called Monster in the Middle. It's set all over the US and at all different times. Starting from the Challenger explosion and going up through different points in American history. The first chapter is called Oakland Gomorrah, and it begins in San Francisco in 1980. 89. Does anybody know what the big thing is that happened there? Yeah, the big earthquake. Okay, yeah, so maybe you know. All right. Yeah, the big earthquake. Yeah, I have lots of friends who lived through it. So we begin there. The light said motel, and there wasn't a bulb missing. Not that it would have mattered if it said hotel or moat, not in all that rain, not after all they had been through. The earthquake, the road, each other. They had avoided crossing the bay altogether. The Bay Bridge had collapsed, but they didn't know that for sure then. They drove south, down into the righteous belly, the holy thighs, San Mateo, St. Jose, St. Luis, St. Maria, St. Barbara, St. Clarita, all the good men and women giving their names to those sad, sad cities. They stopped in the City of Angels. They took the 10 through San Bernardino, drove through Cathedral City just for the name, stopped outside Phoenix, where he dipped a wrench into the engine and made the car purr. A day later in Las Cruces, the crosses. They held each other in the car while soul to soul streamed in through the car's CD player. They stayed on the 10. 10 became a holy number. They drove across Texas almost without stopping, but then they stopped in San Antonio, drove that city until they found the black people, slept on a grocer's floor, bags of rice, their pillows. Then they started back north. We got to avoid Louisiana, Gary said to her, and Mississippi. It had been a mission until Texas, a sacred thing, a quest. After St. Antonio, the road was all Eloise dreamed. The long road unstopping. They were driving into hell, it felt like. It was getting closer to winter, and yet they were getting hotter. They had abandoned the 10, took I-35 to meet St. Marcos, avoided Dallas, followed an off-road just to sight some water called Palestine, then up and up into Arkansas. The sign to a city read, Hope. Eloise held on to that image. The next stop was supposed to be Charlotte. Then they would decide, north to New York or south to Miami. Either way, a boat ride to paradise. But then the rain. When they'd left San Francisco, they hadn't thought they would keep going. On the road still, a day later, he'd reached his right hand out to touch her, she thought, but no. He'd fiddled with the car controls and then slid a circular disc into the mouth of the dashboard. It was a smooth, slippery motion. She didn't know cars came with CD players. I modified it myself, he said. The secular music came on, and then she knew that they were not just fleeing desecration, they were fleeing their lives. In San Bernardino, Gary explained to her why they weren't heathens despite their abandon. You are Noah, he said, with his soft, big voice. I am the animals you saved. You're not an animal, she said gently to reassure him. He wasn't an animal to her, despite his wool hair, dark skin. She and he were at an outdoor restaurant on the outside of the city in a tiny black part, which was also the big Mexican part, though still different parts. She couldn't tell exactly how it was all laid out. She watched him tear the fried chicken with his teeth. She would have preferred that they go to the diner they'd passed miles before, but he told her he didn't want white people to see them together. She tried to cut the chicken with a plastic fork and knife, but she only managed to discard the skin. Gary was looking at her as though he might bite into her. It was the same look he'd given her when he first told her to get in the car. Right now, Ellie, get in, he'd said. I'm a tiger, he said now. I'm a lion, a jaguar, but he couldn't think of any other cats, and so he laughed to himself. A leopard, she said, a puma, all that. Now eat the chicken, you'll be hungry later. She ate the chicken. She was like Noah, a believer.
Hi. This is from Nobody Gets Out Alive. It's a collection of stories, and they're all set in Alaska, many of them in Anchorage, Alaska, which is the city, more urban part of Alaska that's less familiar to people. I think that the only thing you need to know, I realized that I picked kind of a hardcore 5 pages 2 seconds before I just began to read, but is that this is about 2 sisters, and one is 29. That's the narrator, and her sister Jamie is her older sister. A few things for the record that might explain how the night unfolds. The first one took place long ago, when our mother did not drink except at parties, and left the house regularly for groceries and trips to stores and offices and other grown-up places. Even then, however, she pulled Jamie and me from school for snuggle days, during which we never changed out of our nightgowns and read picture books in bed, The Velveteen Rabbit mostly, or Sylvester and the Magic Pebble. Mom was a loving, wonderful parent, even when she'd started disappearing in the afternoons. She hired a girl named Fern to babysit us. Fern was 19 and soft in a plump, bewildered way, as if she expected you to throw a can of soda at her. She had a scar on her face, plus braces and limp, feathery hair that smelled of hot oil treatments, a ritual she completed each week with a magical little vial that she warmed up in the microwave. That summer, Fern also had a boyfriend named Buck, who worked at the strip mall carnival in the back lot of Fred Meyer's. The strip mall carnival had been on our radar for most of our lives. Out it sprang each July, suddenly there on the asphalt like a little toothpick city against the mass of the mountains, each teetering, aging ride pierced with tatters of falling screams. Of course we were dying to go, dying. Fern wouldn't let us. We fought her and crushed her and hopped in the back of Buck's eagle-hooded car for an afternoon of all free rides and all free games, the last of which was when Buck tried to take me into the porta potty and show me how to wipe his dick. I was 7, Jamie was 13. Jamie banged on the door, yelling she was going to puke on his boots, she was going to call the troopers. When he opened up, she grabbed my hand and ran with me to the popcorn cart, where we hid until we heard Fern calling for us. "Guys," she said in her helpless voice, "come on, you guys. I'm going to tell your mom on you." She didn't tell. We didn't either. Instead, Jamie made Fern make us sloppy joes every night for dinner and give us home perms in the guest bathroom. By the end of the summer, Buck was arrested for aggravated assault and rape. His victim was a 65-year-old native lady walking home from a picnic. 6 months later, when Fern tried to steal Mom's Mickey Moto pearls to pay for Buck's bail and bungled the effort, Mom fired her, then arranged for a job as her receptionist at our father's office, then paid for computer classes so Dad wouldn't fire her either. Imagine, Mom told us, being so alone in this world. She smiled as if a sad, old-fashioned song had come on the radio and only she could hear it. At the time, Dad may have applauded his efforts. No one in our family was ever denied the opportunity to self-improve. Like most people in Alaska, we had come from dirt and sorry circumstance, as he described it. Even our house was constantly being gutted and redone with all new carpeting or all new crown molding. He still lives there with our stepmother, though even I can hardly recognize it under all the stonework and marbles and acres of fastidiously painted white decking that in the winter, when Diamond Lake freezes, makes it look like a cruise ship doing a deep final dive into the Arctic Sea. A shiny flotsam of airplanes and speedboats and snow machines washes up by Dad's dock depending on the season. The old family beaver, that's a plane, changes from skis to floats and back to skis. It is an enormous plane, painted the same electric green as the tractor Dad drove as a boy growing up on a dirt floor farm in Minnesota. He bought it to fly Jamie and me out to the wilderness to fish and hunt and not turned into spoiled lake kids. To reinforce the message, he drew up homemade contracts we both had to sign. I will go to college. I will learn to fly. I will shoot a caribou and vote in every election. Signed, Jamie, age 11, and Becca, age 6. Dad is an orthopedic surgeon, but only one who's not starting corporations and shell companies in the Caribbean. He brought his first MRI to Anchorage and developed what many in town called a medical monopoly, which includes various surgery robots and DNA centrifuges and other than visionary diagnostic devices. He housed them in a for-profit clinic where the majority of patients proceeded to pay their bills using an in-state subsidiary of a larger out-of-state HMO on whose board he silently serves. Some of this success was accomplished while he was sober, but not much. Or so I've heard. I am too young to remember the details of parties that neighbors and various strangers bring up still dumbfounded and nostalgic about the night in the backyard with Danny Bob, the time Danny Bob sculpted a king salmon out of ice using an electric turkey carving knife, the time he drew a drill bit for an ACL reconstruction on a cocktail napkin that would go on to be patented and render all other models obsolete, the time he shot his compound bow off the roof of the house and hit a watermelon in a canoe floating in the middle of Diamond Lake. Then there was the glacier bear, about which these people always said, "Did Danny ever get that blue bear back?" Mom has the bear as of a week ago. Dad showed up and at the door and gave it to her. She was so happy to see him and made such a huge sloppy fuss about my putting it in the living room by the window that she asked him to stay for dinner, which in our house means takeout Siam cuisine, a handful of calliope, and a vodka blueberry smoothie. He was very kind about declining and very kind about the rotting piles of newspaper which Mom stacks up and uses to cut out paper snowflakes. They are very worried-looking snowflakes, and there are a lot of them. I'm not sure how memory works. Sometimes I can remember the silky rush of Mom's dress as she walked by and the bright electric bits that sparkled off her between the pantyhose and the fabric. I can remember looking at Jamie to see if she had seen those magical fireworks, confirming by the bright brown gasp in her eyes that she had. I can remember sitting on Dad's lap as he flew us in the Beaver, and his pointing to the sky ahead and telling me to pick a cloud, any cloud, and my believing at this time that they were his to give.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming out in the rain. I'm from Ireland, so. If you waited for it to stop, you'd never go anywhere. I'm just going to read a couple of pages from the start of a story called Whoever's There, Come On Through. And St. County Mayo, where I'm from, on the west of Ireland. And the main character, Eileen, is going over to her best friend, Mert, has just come out of he's been in and out of sort of psychiatric institutions for most of his life, so they're both in their 20s, and she's gone over to visit him. He's staying with his uncle, Nugent. The next time Eileen arrived at Nugent's, there were again 2 cars in the drive. A pug dog was padding around the lawn. Its jowled pus and weepy eyes tracked Eileen as she got out of her car. They kept watching. She walked around the bonnet to retrieve a carton of donuts from the passenger side. The dog belonged to Sarah Duane, Jamie's viewer, which meant that Jamie, Mert's big brother, must be there too. The front door was closed but not locked. A gesture of etiquette still resolutely practiced among certain of the older generation, and which meant, whoever's there, come on through. As Eileen went down the hall, she could hear the scattering, cold points of a young man's laughter, Jamie's laughter. Eileen tapped on the kitchen door, pushed it open. Nugent was sitting on a ragged little settee with a trucker cap covering his bald spot. Mert was at the kitchen table in a cement-coloured hoodie, his laptop in front of him. Jamie was up and in motion, wearing an olive green forestry jacket over a t-shirt, sweatpants, and a pair of battered Chelsea boots, the heels of the boots snapping like fingers as he paced the planked floor. Sarah Duane was in an easy chair drinking Calpol cough medicine straight out of the bottle, a purple tinge banding her top lip. Currency is anyway a legacy structure, Jamie said. Sorry for interrupting, Eileen said, looking from Nugent to Jamie, and then Mert. Mert had the glassy, heaped disposition of someone rooted recently from his bed. Eileen, Nugent said. He rose to his feet, looked down at the settee and sighed. Change, he said, is the bane of my existence, and he bent to recover the coins that had just slipped from his pockets. Nugent, a man once unthinkingly robust, had suffered a stroke several years back. Among the litany of mutinies perpetrated by his body on his body was a lasting deformity to his hands. Each thumb and forefinger had wrenched back and locked in place, an effect that surgery had only partially reversed. His thumbs remained severely kinked like claws, obliging Nugent to roughly sweep the cushion with one palm and catch the splattering coins in the other. Coins are least aesthetically pleasing objects. Notes are just dirty paper, Jamie said. We're on economics now, Nugent said to Eileen. You already missed a lecture on biology. Currency is a sentiment. We can let go of it any time, Jamie said. We just don't want to yet, but rest assured. Not going to happen, Mert said. Trust me, Jamie replied. Currency, computers, they're just technologies, and it's in the nature of technologies to go away. A thing arrives, it proliferates, it grows into ubiquity, and like everything else that reaches ubiquity, it one day disappears. Your dog is outside, so you know, Eileen said. I do know, Sarah said. Cheerio has a ferocious tolerance for his own company, Jamie said, which is commendably undogly of him. I would say he looks a little bit lost out there, Eileen said. He'd come out of his mammy's crease looking exactly as lost, Jamie said. Don't judge a thing off him by that look. What are you saying about my dog, Sarah said to Jamie. And she's a she, for Christ's sakes, the millionth time, I'm telling you. She had the pinched, flushed look of someone enduring something viral. I brought donuts, Eileen said. Donuts, Jamie sneered. Donuts, Sarah repeated. What's wrong with donuts, Eileen said. Nothing. Only there's no credible way for a Mayo accent to say donuts, Jamie said. It was Eileen's opinion that if you wanted demented, if you wanted pathology, here was Jamie. With his vicious jabber and his incoherent clothes, his brain like a door with a busted latch ever been shut. The forestry jacket was pure Jamie. Out of technical college, he'd managed to get a job in which he was paid very well to sit in a porta-cabin in the Balik woods and read the paper while polite, middle-class ramblers visiting from Dublin and the odd school tour tracked around the trails and the ruins. Last year, he'd been suspended and then fired after it was discovered he was taking payments to let travellers burn rubbish on a site in the woods. The smoke had almost completely killed off a listed species of weed that grew wild there. Jamie maintained that the real reason he was let go was that he'd consorted with travellers, treating them with what he insisted was dignity while the council racked their brains to find a way to run them out of town altogether. Eileen recalled the second car outside. She wondered if Jamie had also managed to shack up with Uncle Nugent. Jamie had been the standard, superior big brother, oscillating between picking on and protecting Mert, and still possessed an occult hold over him without even trying. Eileen could already hear Jamie's influence in Mert's voice. Another problem being economics is a theology now, Mert said. Absolutely, Jamie said, absolutely, and the worst one there is. Is he here too, so, Eileen said, asked Nugent, nodding at Jamie. In what sense, Nugent asked. In the sense, is he staying here too? For a spell, Jamie said, would be the situation. Define spell, Nugent said to Jamie, a little irritated. And then to Eileen, I made the mistake in not offering terms, and little have been forthcoming. Nuge understands solidarity, Jamie said, and he's a tender-hearted cunt underneath it all. Nuge is frankly sound, Mert said. We love him, Jamie said. Stop, Nugent said. Eileen came over to the table, popped open the donut carton. She bought 5, figuring one apiece for Mert, Nugent and herself, with an extra one each for the boys. Have at them, she said. Are those from the Maxall out of the Tesco, Jamie asked. Yeah, Eileen said. Excellent. They're of course not good, but they're the best you'll get in this corner of the world, Jamie said, lifting a glazed ring and taking a bite. I'll have a half, Sarah said. Jamie tore his donut in half and tossed her the bitten part. You're a prickhole, she said, and threw it back at him. It landed on the floor. Nugent said he would put on the tea. I was thinking we could go into town, maybe, Eileen said to Mert, or a walk. Thanks, Eileen, Mert said, rising from his seat to reach for a donut. Jamie leaned in and he measuredly twacked the carton down the table towards his little brother. And how's Big Devani, Jamie asked Eileen, meaning her partner, Mark. He's sound. How's your little book? What's your little book called again? Ashley. Ashley, Jamie repeated. When I saw Devani's other boy, the teenage lad in town, the other day, that'd be Danny. It's an uncanny business, Jamie said. What is, Mert asked. Children, Jamie said. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, 3. I'm just going to reiterate how fantastic these works were to read, so please read them if you haven't read them. I'm really honored to be in the company of these 3 amazing authors and to be able to chat with them today. So my first question, and how this is going to go, you all, is just I'm going to ask some open-ended questions. If you all would, like to bounce off each other or ask each other questions, please feel free to do that. And then hopefully we'll have time to take a couple questions from the audience again. So my first question, because the theme of this panel is, of course, where we come from, is how are you defining home, or how do you define home? So it's a pretty open-ended question. You can interpret it whichever way you'd like, but let's start with Leigh. If you
I'm
will.
the worst at this one. I grew up in Alaska. But by the time I was 9, my mom had moved back to Baltimore, and so every 3 months I moved between Baltimore and Alaska. My parents had joint custodies, and it was the 70s, and I think they thought that was equitable or something. I don't regret it at all. I learned about the East Coast, and I learned about the wilderness, but it's interesting to me now because I don't live in Alaska anymore, but I write about it a lot. It's just so vivid in my mind. It's what I want to write about, and mostly I want to write about what I love, so I really love Alaska, so it's a pleasure for me, and sometimes it's the Alaska that I'm writing is gone with global warming and how things are changing, and sometimes I'm able to bring that into my work in small ways, talk about the fact that everybody's getting air conditioners, talk about now there's a fall. We never had a fall before. It used to be that winter would last into May. Now it's like April, and there's a real spring. Depending where you are, it's a big state. It's like trying to describe India. But I would say, I worry and struggle about that question all the time because I never thought I'd be living in New York City. And I luckily mostly live in Connecticut in the rural woods where I have a setup that's not un-Alaskan. I mean, like I have chickens and I have a garden and I live in the middle of the woods and I have a wood stove and it requires a lot of work. So it's a lot like living in a cabin. And I probably will go home one day. But I have young children and they like it here a lot. So I don't know what home is anymore. I guess I've given up on that. I want to say something clever like home is where your family is or something. That's just not who I am. Sometimes I feel like I just didn't really get a home, that I'm living in different places all the time and I'm gathering what I can from them. And the ones that I fall in love with are the ones I write about, and the ones that I don't really talk about.
Tiphanie.
Everything I write about is about belonging and about trying to figure out who we belong to, either by choice or by necessity or by choices that were made before we were even born. And this book is no different. I'm from the Virgin Islands, as you said in the beginning, and we are, a colony of the United States. And so we're also, as Virgin Islanders, always thinking about, like, well, do we belong to the Caribbean or do we belong to the United States? And this book is my first book that's really about Americanness and about the ways in which people like me who immigrate into our own country come to be a part of it or find ways to exist inside of it, belong to it, and even have it belong to us in fractured kinds of ways. So there's 2 families in the book. One family is from the Virgin Islands, and one family is a family that's like rooted historically in the U.S. And they are working their way towards each other over the course of the book till eventually 2 of them fall in love. So the book is written like these 2 trains that are coming towards each other, maybe to crash or maybe to kiss. We'll see how it ends. So for me, I'm constantly questioning that, and it's not a fraught, like I'm not pissed off about it. In fact, it gives me something to question and trouble, which is why I write. I only want to write about things that I have questions about. If I have the answers, I don't really care. Like, what the fuck is the point of that? So for me, the books are always about like having questions and trying to find new ways to ask new kinds of questions. So the question of like where I belong, who I belong to, and what does it mean to belong is ongoing. I am always a Virgin Islander, but I'm also.
Colin, would you like to take that
Oh,
one?
yeah. I mean, I write about a very, a very specific area, very small area, on the west coast of Ireland, where I grew up. And when I went to college, and I was in Dublin, over on the other side of Ireland, a few hours away. But I was trying to write. I'd finished college and I was working in a call center, and I was trying to write, and he was all shite. And it took me a long time to realize I could just write about like where I'm from and the kind of people I know, because I didn't know what I was writing. I was writing all sorts of stuff, and but it wasn't about like, you know, a small town in the west of Ireland. And eventually I started writing about it. And I guess it took so long because I kind of didn't want to write about it, you know, which I think is probably what most writers go through. A long period of finding ways not to write about what they have to write about. But that unlocked something in it anyway, and it made the writing a bit stronger and a bit more alive, and it felt more credible to me. This is all just an entirely private process. I wasn't showing it to anyone or anything like that. This is just stuff I was writing down, you know, in a laptop, wherever. And but it just felt stronger to me, and so it kind of just went from there. And it's funny because in the first Homesickness is my second book of stories, and the first one, when I was writing that, I mean, some of those stories are 10, 12 years old in that first book, and when I was writing them, I still lived in Ireland. I lived in Dublin, but I was young enough. I was only in my 20s, so I was home a lot, and I was, you know, go back home, and you just sort of start acting like regress immediately to like a teenager with your, you know, your mother be there cooking you the dinner and everything. You're just, you know, acting. So I kind of I was very much writing about a kind of life I knew and was still kind of provisionally very familiar with and still almost living in, you know. It was like I just lived in Dublin during the week and then went home, you know. That was still emotionally and stuff, and psychologically it felt that was where I still was. I'd go back and see my best friends and stuff. And anyway, you get older and you go build a life elsewhere. Now I live abroad. And so a lot of these stories in Homesickness were written when I was abroad. So this is more pure, the stories in it are more purely from memory, they come from memory, you know. I mean, I've only been home, I was saying to Leigh just outside, I've only been home once in like the last 3 or 4 years, obviously, because of the pandemic. But so yeah, home is more and more just an artifact of memory, and that just gave a very different quality to these stories. And in a way, it made them worth writing, even though they revisit a lot of, not in a lot of ways, but there is some stories in there about young people, and there's stories that are very, you know, could at least, if you describe them, they could easily, it sounds like they could fit in the first book or whatever, you know. But it's just that my distance in time, as well as geography from home, just made them intrinsically more, just very different propositions, and it was very, very exciting when I was writing them to try and figure out what that was, what that meant.
I love that first book of stories.
Thank you.
I actually went home a lot to write these stories. I could get only so far, and then I would go home, and I would spend a month just like really isolated in my friend's cabin and write the stories, because I couldn't write from this distance. I could write like the first 10 pages, and then the next 15 had to be written at home. So I went home a lot.
Did Colin or Tiphanie, did you go home to write any of this, likely, or?
Yeah, I always find that I create best when I'm physically at home. I mean, I'm from the Virgin Islands. It's fucking beautiful, and I feel like beauty is very helpful. You know, if the one thing that we sometimes forget that we're up to as fiction writers or as readers too is what we're up to is experiencing beauty. Like that's really what we're doing. I think at the like the most, you know, basic level, we're here to just be like, whoa, right? And to just like fall in love, which is also, I think, part of what beauty is for. And we want to fall in love with the language and the literature. And for me, being in a beautiful place helps make me write more beautifully. And there's no place else in my imagination more beautiful than the Virgin Islands. So being home physically helps me create, but like in a messed up way, I feel like to revise, I have to be away, actually. Like to be more clear-headed and not get so obsessed with my language that I'm only following the language and I'm only thinking about like, you know, Baroque details. To actually kind of be more mercenary and more like of a bitch, I need to leave and maybe be someplace that is a lot more austere. So I am lucky enough that I can kind of travel back and forth. That's the benefit of having a job like at a university. Like they just pay me to, I'm like, I'm doing research on this beach in the Virgin Islands. I highly recommend this job. So that allows me to be able to have that. But I suppose even if I didn't have that ability to move, I could enclose myself in places that were more austere, because revision happens more when my mind is clear and I'm not too overly obsessed with the beauty. I'm more obsessed with like, you know, does the plot make sense? And are the characters doing what I need them to do from chapter 1 to chapter 17?
Colin, any thoughts on?
Yeah. I mean, I did. I mean, again, it takes me a long time to finish collections and stuff in general, and so I wrote probably the stories in this again are probably the oldest one is probably 6-7 years old. So it would have been written when I was back in Ireland. I've lived in Toronto the last 5 years, 5 and a bit. So a couple of them were definitely written in Ireland, yeah, I mean, really, it feels like you probably do. You know, I really do want to get back. I don't think it definitely changed them. You know, it definitely changed how they were. I mean, the pandemic just necessitated. I had to just work from memory. I mean, and it's not like it's nothing to do with even the sort of like documentary details. It's not that I'm like forget where the street like. My versions of where I'm from have always been pretty fluid in that way anyway, in terms of the concrete details. But it's just the people and their temperament and the way they look at the world, which you realise has completely informed the way you look at the world without you realising it. And I think a little bit like what Tiphanie says, when you're away from it then, you can see that a little bit more objectively maybe, whereas when you're back in it, my accent gets thicker and I just start talking, like whenever I ring home and talking to my mother on the phone, my wife says, your accent, you just completely gets way thicker suddenly on the phone. And so it's the same when I go home. So I don't know. I mean, I mean, I'll be home less and less, I mean, I realise at some point I won't live in Mayo again. I don't think I'll live there again. I mean, we'll probably end up back in Ireland maybe, but I won't live in Mayo. It'll only be a place I visit, which is weird. So that just... that filled me with melancholy, and I don't know what it means for my writing, but anyway, I'm going to figure that out.
So I found it really interesting that you've already touched on this a little bit, which I find, I love that. You've all three included locations of where you're from in each of your works, but you might not necessarily live there anymore. Leigh, you no longer live in Alaska. Tiphanie, you still live in Atlanta, but no longer in the Virgin Islands. Colin, you no longer live in Ireland, but my question is there something you wanted to communicate about these three locations of where you're from to your readers that they might not have known? So of course we all have notions of Ireland, Alaska, Virgin Islands, and Atlanta, but I've only been to Atlanta. I've never been to Alaska or Ireland. So what did you want to communicate to your readers?
Well, I feel like when I say I'm from Alaska, I just have to be prepared to speak to that person for a while. Do you know what I mean? It's just like, don't mention it or mention it and just sit down. Talk to them for a while because they either went on a cruise or they wanted to go on a cruise. And it's okay. I don't mind it. Now I'm like ready in life to just kind of unpack what it was like. And I had like a very unconventional childhood. We had airplanes. We flew into the wilderness. We built our own cabin. We hunted and fished for food. We were, those, people. And then we also lived in town, and we had like sidewalks. And we went to Fred Meyer and, got pants. We had a remote control for the garage. And sometimes I feel like that's really what I was there was two things I was trying to bring out, like what the real Alaska is like, because people will just look at me and be like, my tractor broke, you're from Alaska, can you fix it? And I'm like, no, I cannot.
Except that you can.
I know. Except for that I can like run a generator. Yeah, things like that. I can. I just, there's a lot of like life skills I have. They are always like, can you fly the plane? And I'm like, if everybody else on the plane that's competent to fly the plane is dead, I will fly the plane.
That's amazing.
Yeah. That's actually, my dad taught me how to fly like that because he was afraid he was going to get a heart attack, right? And then I would be the only one. So I had to sort of learn to fly a plane really early, like when I was 6 or 7. And by fly, that means like tip up, follow there's a thing called a Loran directions. So, but I guess I wanted to talk about the unexpected parts about Alaska because growing up, I've been fed all this like frontier guy short stories set in Montana, and the guys would go out and they'd get drunk and they'd put an elk rack on their head and they were up to all kinds of stuff. And there was a part of me that loved those stories, but I think they like really messed with my imagination for many years. It was like such a male narrative, and Alaska's actually really diverse. There's all kinds of different people living there. It is majority male, and so what I really wanted to talk about was a lot of the women in Alaska that don't get the same kind of, and I wanted to come through with, what it's like to live in a state, with, men are wonderful, but there's a lot of them up there, and there's huge amounts of domestic violence and alcoholism and sexual assault and murder on a daily basis that I grew up with every day. I cannot tell you the amount of people I know, women that have been killed or disappeared or just very, just had to live with things I wish they didn't have to live with, and we all had to live it with them. And then on the other hand, because it was a wild state, there are women that went out and flew airplanes and cleared their own homestead, and a lady who lived across the lake from me in this deserted lake, and she ran her own lodge with her son, and just liked being alone, was possibly the rudest person I have ever met in my life, but God bless her, she did it, and completely left the ideas of society when she got up there in the 40s as a single mom living in a cabin by herself and running a lodge. So it's those kind of contrasts that I wanted to show and talk about that I didn't feel like I had seen anywhere else. And I think that gave me a real sense of purpose about what I was doing. Because it's great to tell a story and you want it to mean something because of all the relationships, and you want it to mean something because of the language, but you also want it to mean something in the larger context of who we are as a society and where that's left people.
I would like to go next because I feel like what you're saying is pretty much what I would say too about what I want to communicate about the Virgin Islands, because it's a very similar kind of place in the American imagination, right? It's out there, American. They speak English. Let's go. You don't have to have a passport. Let's go. I went on a cruise, right? So it's the same thing for when I think about what people imagine about the Virgin Islands. And I ultimately, whenever I write, I think a big, it's hard because those of us who are writing from places that are part of the cultural imagination but are not real to people have this extra duty. And I think, writers of color have this, queer writers have this, because those are also part of the cultural imaginations but not real to people. This extra duty to create truth and to write with honesty and to complicate your imagination, right? So that we can all experience these places as being nuanced and complex and full of actual humans. So for me, a big part of what I want to do when I write about the Virgin Islands is write and communicate that actual people live there. And not people who only serve you your lovely daiquiri on the beach, but that those people who do that also have complex lives and go home and they don't give a fuck about you afterwards, right? And so I wanted to make sure that that we just see a full truth of humanity. And I constantly have this experience where people who have lived in the Virgin Islands for a small amount of time, which I'm sure you have in Alaska too, people who are kind of there half the year or come there to work during the tourist season, and they'll be they'll tell me I read your book, but that's not the Virgin Islands. And I'd be who the fuck are you? But this idea that people who live there even for 6 months, or what I call long-term tourists who might live there for a year, who feel they know the place because they've been there for a while, but places that are very touristic, we are very adept at protecting our truths, right, in order to stay safe and to be able to perform whatever we need to perform to get the money and then to go back and be our real nuanced selves. So for me, I want to write about our real nuanced selves and complicate that and make that beautiful. Did you guys see that there's a balloon up there?
Yeah.
It says welcome.
I feel it's a metaphor for writing with complexity and specificity and beauty.
Thank you, Tiphanie. Colin, any thoughts on what you wanted to communicate about County Mayo?
I don't know. As I said, it was, the stories ended up being the result of a very long private process, of writing for yourself, for a long time. I always wanted to be published and stuff, but it didn't really seem, for a long time, it didn't seem feasible. I wasn't sure really the practical steps you take, right, as I said before, like I never met a writer until I had a book, well, a story published anyway, and I got invited to a reading, and so it was very private. I mean, what I did was I found other stories and voices, and I realized they were doing the same thing, and I copied them, not just Irish writers, but endless amount of writers who've written very distinctively about places that are either very peripheral or very, but that doesn't matter, because it's that slow realization that actually everything's there, everything you need is there. What you grew up with, it's enough. You have it all there. You have all of human experience there. In as Tiphanie says, exactly the people who, in other contexts, they might be. It doesn't. Everyone contains, all of it, right? And so, you just slowly realize it's all there. It's all there. I just have to trust that. That I can take a character, a person I know, who might just be a stereotype in some way or whatever, in other things, a small town hoodlum or, a kind of lonely bachelor or whatever, or the sort of, put upon mother, and just trusting that you can find, that you can draw on your own life experiences and memories of people like that, and just give them, you don't have to give them dimensionality, they have it, you have to see it. By looking hard enough and paying attention. So, that Mayo is where I was raised. I didn't, so that was going to be my canvas, Yeah.
I can't believe it, but we have just 5 minutes left. I wish we had 30 minutes, an hour left, but just 5. So I'm going to see if anyone in the audience has any questions for our 3 phenomenal authors, and if not, I will ask them a final question. But do we have any audience questions? Okay, I guess I'll be the one to ask the question. Okay.
Yeah, I feel it all the time, and it's really important to me to protect the Virgin Islands, and to, there aren't very many of us writing about the Virgin Islands either, so for many readers, if they're going to encounter Virgin Islands literature, they may encounter it only through me, and so it's very important to me that I write them with honesty, but I also protect them. At the same time, I don't know how you feel, but I write first for Virgin Islanders. It's a fucked up thing to say, because now none of you can buy my book, but I'm so, I'm sorry. I hope you still will, because, literature is for everyone, but, I write for myself, I write for my grandmother who's deceased and who taught me about literature, I write for the Virgin Islands, I write for the US, I write for Black people, I write for all people, but there's circles, right? But, so for me, I feel like if I'm writing for the Virgin Islands, I do have to speak to them, honestly, and that does sometimes mean I'm saying things to Virgin Islanders that I don't want other people to hear. But the way that our publishing industry works is I don't get to the Virgin Islands if I don't go through the US. And so it's like I can't speak to my own people if I don't go through the United States first. So I'm like, well, you guys get to eavesdrop, okay. So, and I hope that that's okay, and sometimes it's not. Some people are mad at me at home a lot.
Yeah, that's what I was worried about a lot with everyone when I kicked my head in the Mayo, when I wrote these stories. But I think I get what you're saying about wanting to protect where you're from, like wanting to do it justice, but yeah, not sentimentalize it or tell the truth, but what your truth is, which is just all you have, really, and. I don't know. I think that's a really great thing about fiction. It just allows you to. I don't think I'd have any interest in writing about where I'm from. I love writing about where I'm from, but through the prism of fiction. I don't. It's just a very freeing way to do that. To sort of look at it squarely, and take things and experiences and write about them truthfully. And I've been lucky. Most people, anyone I talk to from home who's read my book, from all ages and walks of life. They're happy with it, basically. They don't, they like the rough edges. They like the dark parts. to recognize it?
I think that my way of dealing with that is, it's a little bit what I talked about before, but it's also that like, there's so many different Alaskas. There's so many stories that haven't been told yet. There's immigration stories. There's, 23 different tribes, those stories that are coming out now. A lot of stories in Alaska were written by people that came up and visited for a very long time. So it was very much outside in and not inside out. And then those books that were written in the state didn't really get publishers and did not really reach, and that's still true to this day. It's one of the things I do is I'm helping some writers right now in villages who do live very, very far out, get their books together and trying to get them agents and trying to get them into the mainstream. But ultimately, I think when it comes to my own writing, I took a very specific angle that's completely related to myself and my being and my voice and my life. So, yes, there are people that come up to me and go, "Oh, I know who Danny Bob is. What about that blue bear? It's so great that you wrote down family stories and made them fiction." With almost no realization of like how much artistry and work went into making those stories, and that half the time the person they're talking about is not the person I was writing about at all. It's some amalgamation of like 5, swashbuckling bush pilots who have, I know a ton of them who had only girls as daughters. So I think the best thing that I did was just kind of say, well, there's going to be some people that love me and some people that hate me, and most people won't know who I am. So I'll just keep going.
I think that's a perfect way to end. Thank you, Tiphanie. Thank you, Leigh. Thank you, Colin. What a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, that was fun.